Hello and welcome to PerchPeek Pods, the only place to get long-form interviews with some of the world's leading global mobility experts. I'm very excited to be joined today by Larry Brouder, who categorically is a mobility expert, having had senior in-house positions, senior vendor side positions. So he's seen the full spectrum and sort of has probably forgotten more about mobility than I've learned in my lifetime. So really looking forward to having a great chat today, Larry. Welcome to the pod. Introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about how you fell into the world of mobility.
Thanks. And yeah, I guarantee that I've forgotten a lot about mobility, which is maybe fortunate or unfortunate. It's one of those things. And you talk to everybody, nobody really says I grew up wanting to be in mobility. Yeah. It's much more I grew up wanting to be a fireman or something.
Yeah.
But I was in the process. I had a business that was completely on the different side of the planet, mobility wise. I was a auto restoration guy, but I had come from a business background with a business education with a 4-year internship and things. So I wanted to get back into the business world, and I was interviewing a number of places and with some government roles and things like that. And a friend said, you really should look at this mobility company.
Wow.
Way back in the day, Caldwell Banker Relocation's no longer. It became part of one of the big companies. And so I went, I interviewed, as luck would have it, got involved, and it was immediately hooked. And so it was a good application of some, business experience that I had, of some real estate knowledge that I had. It's such a broad base that I fell for it immediately. And I also fell for the helping component, because I think we do a lot of helping.
Yeah, that is, not to go too doughy-eyed for a second, but it is such a great part of our industry, right? It's like the end person is so greatly helped by what we do, which is, not necessarily the case in every industry. So, not to sort of aggrandize what we do too much, but it does give the warm and fuzzies on that side of things. Where I really wanted to jump into today was I think we were introduced initially by Paul Soley. And we were sort of discussing, he was like, we were looking at our managed lump sum solution at the time. And I think he introduced us and sort of said, you should go speak to Larry about it. And I remember you sort of explaining the dynamics of changes in regulation in the US, specifically around tax breaks to relocation back in 2017. And obviously there's so many elections going on this year. I know legislation and government regulation is something you're very hot on in terms of the impact on mobility. So I'm going to throw a very general one at you. What, where do you think legislation is having a big impact on mobility right now? What should people be looking out for?
Well, apart from it seems recent, but in 2017, the shifts that happened relative to taxation in the U.S., I think that one of the big impacts right now is people trying to navigate the way that they staff effectively, given organizational needs and immigration. And it's a hot button everywhere in the world. There's, border to border, on any combination of borders. There's some sort of either welcoming environment in certain cases where countries are doing what they can to entice people to buy property and being kind of lenient. And there's other situations where it's extremely restrictive, it's protectionist, it could be adversarial. And so to navigate all this in the U.S. environment, especially, while also noting this really desperate need for talent. And I think that the talent thing is what kind of drives everything. And so unfortunately, those tend to butt up against each other. Because if we're trying to find the talent, but we're restricted relative to who we can bring in, and our educational system isn't churning out enough of a specific type of person, whether it's interest-based or, kind of the trajectory of education-based, we're in a pickle. It's really difficult to find the balance. So I think that will have the largest impact
Yeah.
on what we do, the speed at which we do it, how that integrates into the hiring process, and hopefully integrates more into the hiring
Yeah.
process. Um,
So,
and the way that programs are moving
yeah,
forward.
yeah, so much to dig into there. Firstly, you work for an international company now. You've worked on the supplier side, operating with lots of different companies. When you have that sort of split of, some countries where it's hard to get immigration, you're sitting in the US right now, UK sort of changing or as part of the election, really threatening to change their immigration process. What do you see? How do you see companies typically responding to those changes? Are they fluid? Like, how do you manage it?
Somewhat. And it
Somewhat.
depends on it depends on the speed of the change. And as we know, in both countries that you and I represent,
Yeah.
Those changes can shift pretty dramatically around elections and global occurrences and things like that. So companies do have to be fluid in that regard. I mean, there's extremes like a few years ago in one of the administration changes here, the extremes led us to having to do things like call people and say, don't get on a plane because we don't know that you'll be allowed in.
Yeah.
In some cases, it's more gradual, and it's a shift that may impact timing. The other thing that impacts is volume from a specific country.
Yeah.
And that may delay processes. And so while the business drivers are saying, we've got to have it now, and you got to make it work. While there's usually a way to do it, sometimes there's not.
100%. Actually, that's I said we go our script, so here we go. So when because it's so hard, like individuals in the business probably not keeping abreast of immigration news. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. How do you try and educate them that maybe historically it was fine to hire people from certain markets, and now it's either impossible or going to take 6-9 months, whatever it is. How do you try and educate the business on these very fast moving changes?
It depends on the maturity level of the organization. In startups, it's harder, and you have to do more direct education on immigration process and relocation process and things like that. So it's critical, and it's kind of easier when they're smaller.
Yeah.
But you get a lot of pushback because you go in and you say, here's the things we have to do. Like, we're required to do these things, and we're policy driven to do these things, and we're cost driven to do these things. And, and then the business need is there. So it's kind of spinning a lot of plates and juggling and operating quickly. As organizations mature, and I've been in a couple that have been kind of in that process, especially as global locations are added to the mix, your opportunity to kind of diversify the way you bring people in happens. It just kind of starts to organically grow, and things like L visa options and stuff like that. Initially, it's more like, do we have to bring somebody in as a contractor? How do we manage that effectively? And that increases the cost. But sometimes in startup mode, that's not really a problem. Sometimes it's a big problem. But then as organizations mature and those global locations open up, and you can start to spread that, it helps twofold, because it helps to give you options to either park someone somewhere, or it gives you an option to bring them in through a specific route. And then it also infuses more of the organization culture, because the culture starts to kind of permeate those other locations as you spread people around.
Yeah, and then you get that more into the classic use cases. I did want to pick up on that. Startups can be particularly hard for this, because I feel like when I start up myself, it's like the whole culture is, but we're doing things people haven't done before, like just move fast and break things. And then when it sort of comes to immigration, when people sometimes say, we could just make it work, and sometimes you do have to be like, no, actually, like, this is like government rules. You can't just call up the embassy and make these things happen. And it is always amazing with our startup clients. So like the pressure they come under, like, I'll just make it happen. It's like, no, these are some of the slowest moving government embassies out there. It's kind of challenging to educate them. That's on the educational side. What about on the more positive side? Because one of the things I've always been curious about is there more of a role for mobility in terms of location strategy, almost tangibly helping some of the talent acquisition or location strategy teams with saying, hey, we should be thinking about recruiting from here, here, and here based on immigration changes. What are your thoughts on our ability as an industry to have slightly more impact in that space?
It's been an interesting evolution because a number of years ago, the human resources outsourcing kind of was all the thing and all the rage. And so it was starting to find solutions at a really local level based on a consolidated knowledge of administrative process and requirements locally, et cetera. And then I think relocation industry as a whole has been pretty savvy in the way that they've looked at it and started to affiliate and integrate with global employment companies, et cetera. So it's kind of gone from this localized thing in the same way that a company would to evolving into this thing that says, we will give you options for a locational hire that you might not be able to do or have access to or understand the implications of. And so it's been a really nice transition to know that companies have options that are being created for them by an industry that cares about that and also understands compliance and compliance issues that could arise.
Yeah, no, I love that. And it does help sort of move it away from being super tactical to being like, okay, like here are some different solutions for it. I wanted to go back to actually the first set of changes you mentioned on the legislation side of things and how much of an impact that can have both on like individual company policies, but also their ecosystem as a whole. So just talk us through some of the changes that in law in 2017 and some of the downstream impacts you've seen from the changes, because this podcast is listened to over 30 countries. Some people, every country has different laws. Specifically, what happened in the US and what's the impact then?
Yeah, so a shift in the taxability of benefits created. Initially, it was kind of slow, but slow for my taste. But it created this policy shift, and then everybody tried to kind of work through what's the value of the relocation provider in that. In some cases, it pushed people to be more global, and that was a really good thing. But then they said, well, we encounter similar issues globally. Countries are making these decisions relative to taxability all over the place all the time. So at the time, I was assisting with some, kind of tax models and building and stuff like that. And so we were trying to create a global enough thing, but also something that could be applied on a country to country basis. And so the legislation created this shift in things in the industry. The challenge with the industry, and it's always been the challenge, is that if you hang on to specific revenue streams, especially relative to housing, and especially in U.S. housing, things like the recent legislation relative to commissions in the United States can really throw a curveball. And then at the same time, if you have something like a pandemic that shifts the market drastically, and you're sitting in a place where either you have to manage a number of properties globally that may or may not have tenants, or may have tenants that don't have to pay rent, or all these things are happening. It's the perfect storm. So if you hold on to those revenue streams, you're going to get bit. If you have too big of an inventory load in your company, you're going to get bit. And so that was a really distinct kind of coming together of right beforehand a shift in national, policy and tax code, and a global event that drastically impacted the market. And so these things, they never operate in a vacuum.
100%.
So it's really important as you look at it to say, what do we look like if
100%.
these things change? And I'm not sure. I think relocation up for the longest time was somewhat reactive in that way, and it started back in 72 with the 72 339, and also because the relationships between countries change and amidst all of this, it really, you have to be super agile. So I think there have been a move towards being more agile, but there was a lack of agility initially.
Yes. Yeah. And I think, just to be specific, those that aren't aware, the US sort of basically made all relocation benefits taxable. So, there weren't any, in the UK, certain benefits are non-taxable. So it doesn't really make sense to give people cash. You may as well spend it on tax-exempt benefits such as temporary accommodation or household goods or destination services. In the US, that all changed. And so you did see a big shift towards companies just providing people with cash, or, there was less tax incentive to not do that. And you just see that perpetuate through the ecosystem. And that then does lead to that, as you say, sort of disrupts traditional business models and revenue streams coming out of that. I think in a year, and this ties into the immigration piece you mentioned as well, in a year where there's so many elections going on, so many of these changes are going to come into place. It really, if you're mobility and immigration leader, you need to be on the pulse of like what the changes might be. And I think on our side of the fence, on the supplier side, it's like, hey, like, how could these impact revenue stream? Where are there opportunities? Right. Are there, are more people going to go to sort of towards more cash-based approaches, and that's an opportunity? But they're going to move, where do these sorts of things, and as you say, being agile and responding to those with new solutions rather than just being like, oh, that sucks, and it's harder to, get a visa for someone in the US or the UK or whatever it is. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of like you have to be responsive, because there always will be opportunities.
But I also think that if we go back to our core and we say, like, what's the real critical thing? It's getting somebody on the ground with their individual or family. It's getting them on the ground in a way where they get to the destination relatively sane, and they haven't been impacted in a way that makes them angry at the company. And, so these things, whether it's a transfer or a hire or like, it's really, really critical. So I think that, I think the sway to go that far towards throwing money at it was a big mistake.
100% agree with that.
Because, we've heard the complaints and seen the exceptions and seen the additional cash rolled out. And so it would behoove us to say, what's the core direction of what we do? Is it to get the person there and make them productive? And most companies, they get that and they do 100%. That. But in some cases, if we focus on how we are going to earn money off of that situation, we kind of lose sight of it. So,
I love that. Yeah. It's sort of focusing on the end customer and their problems, which I don't think that's why we start PerchPeek is stressful relocating, right? And that's what our whole industry is predicated around. There's so much opportunity within that space to help with that stress. But if you sort of sit back and sort of think about, okay, we used to make money in this way and that's not as viable anymore, that can just get in the way. So that sort of customer obsession, super interesting. And it's going to be UK election coming up, a lot of chat about immigration, US election coming up.
We have one going too,
yeah, exactly. I didn't hear much about it so far, but it's so crazy how much immigration is a feature of pretty much all the elections around the world, to be honest. It's it's kind of interesting in our world that we are so connected to it, and creates opportunities. You touched on it a little bit there. You're always very much on the forefront of trying to use technology to improve things in mobility, various ways. I know you've tried to do that in the past. Let's speak a little bit about how you see the industry evolving from the perspective of utilization of AI. In particular, like, where do you, obviously it's going to speed everyone up, it's going to make them more efficient, drafting docs, taking notes, all of that stuff, fine. But where do you specifically see within like the key things that mobility folks do? Where are you seeing AI have an impact?
I think we have to be cautious and thoughtful and, attentive to what the potential impact is. It's because it can impact everything. And so the problem with AI right now is if we just let it run the show, everything will get very vanilla very quickly. It'll kind of generate boring stuff. Because it'll say in these instances, we always should do this thing based on the selection of the data that it pulls.
Yeah.
So I've seen some initial kind of pretty flashy tools with, automated attendance to answer questions and things. The challenge right now is that it's chunky. So as people see those things, they're like, that's great, but you didn't care enough to send a real human to me. So I'm a little bit concerned. I think right now the best application is in the administrative support of the people that do the business and do the work. So forms, kind of initial policy generation, although you really got to churn through it if you use it for policy. A lot of editing has to happen. Thanks. But administrative support will free up people to do what they really should be doing, which is face-to-face discussions.
Yes.
Hopefully it'll go that direction. The other thing that I think it can do is to assist with things like the financial side, because you can amass so much data. You can pull tables from all over the place. You can, tax and expense and stuff like that should be really made easy.
Yeah, I love that. I'm going to push back on one of the things you mentioned there. I definitely agree with too. So, because I agree on the policy side, when we've tied with it, whenever we sort of have touched base on it, it's been really exciting to see it. Like generates policies that's feasible, but that always just needs so much editing and like positioning around the company and the whatever. And we keep trying different prompts, and it's just like it looks cool in our demos, but then we sort of say, oh well, there's not really end up that different from just taking a template and adjusting it. We're like, when we target ourselves, we're like, you still need so much of as long as you have good templates. So if you don't have a template, great, definitely do it. But otherwise, it fit for sure. What I definitely agree is the speeding up of those manual processes. So mobility specialists, in our case, relocation coaches as well. Just so much sort of fast. Like I think of our relocation coaches, they're there for like empathy and expertise, not for just typing out the same thing the whole time to answer relocators. And similarly for mobility specialists, sort of just doing the same manual calculation 1,000 times, it just doesn't really make sense. Let's have those conversations. And definitely for cost estimates and access to data, I'm pretty excited about that space. Just sort of, it's not quite there, but the ability to just really bring down the cost of access to data is I think pretty exciting. And overall, it's and I think that
we've had discussions because you've thought about how to use that to facilitate experience and support at the same time. So that's really the way to kind of zero in on what could be done with it. Because those things really matter. And it's not just providing from a bank of information. It's saying, okay, tailor this based on these real individual need, the associated policy, the destination, et cetera, and come up with a real kind of solution that feels good.
Exactly. And I think that's it. It's like not just fully outsourcing or automating, but speeding things up. So very sort of, excited in that space. So you touched there on the speeding up that AI is going to do in the mobility role. You also said sort of how much that roles are changing within mobility earlier. What are you seeing? Most people listening to the pod are mobility and immigration leaders, reward leaders, or maybe earlier in their group, mobility specialists, advisors, etc. What are you seeing in terms of the evolution of typical roles in mobility?
That's a great question. My alma mater had talked to me about building a program that might be mobility based.
Oh, cool.
And so it evolves as we try to create it.
Tough time to do it.
Which is kind of what I think is going to happen with mobility roles in the future. The core goes back to our first part of this discussion, which is you take a really broad base of needs and every location in the world that you could combine.
Yeah.
And if you get the right person in that seat, that they have the right attributes, they will just be a solution generator. And
Yeah.
so I think it's less describing the role and it's more describing the person. And
Yeah.
so as opposed to saying you're going to be a relocation counselor and you're going to handle, buyer value option home sales and people moving to Botswana, and like it's not that anymore. It's saying I need someone who's empathetic. I need somebody who can manage multiple disciplines at the same time, who can manage navigating things that are financial and human and individual, who has a great relationship capability with vendors, with corporations, with other people on the team, et cetera. So it's going to be more defining the person to sit in that solution generating spot.
Yeah.
And then leveraging AI to say, here's the potential solutions that would work from a compliance perspective, et cetera.
Yeah.
So we may get further away from a dictated policy that somebody reads off a sheet, and get more into groups of people that can navigate all that stuff, that have access to immediate choices.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I definitely am aligned with the broadening of the scope of mobility roles. You mentioned a bunch of being empathetic, being financial, good at dealing with vendors, etc. How are you interviewing? You've hired a bunch of people in the past into mobility roles. How are you sort of trying to interview for those skills?
It's not operating from the rote questions that we've had in the past. Like, I don't care what somebody sees themselves as 5 years from now, because the average span in most jobs is a year and a half.
Yeah,
so they're
true.
like, I'll see myself in sitting on the beach in Bali. So it's much more about creativity and problem solving and poise and caring, compassion, and like it's these things that we probably should have been thinking about all along. Unless it was old school. I started in the insurance industry, and back then it was like the numbers told the story. You did what you were supposed to do. Like it was all policy driven, and actuarial too, and it was totally numbers driven. But I would say that interviewing now, it's to find out what that that emotional intelligence is, and to find out what that real intelligence and problem solving ability, and to ask questions that may seem not necessarily absurd, but off the normal track. To do that. I was in a government interview years and years and years ago where they did everything that they could to throw you.
Really?
And it was a panel interview of 6 people, and it was crazy. But I use some of that now because I think that you have to be able to kind of withstand that. You can't enter a mobility job and be hit with someone having a really, kind of a crisis, because it's an emotional thing to go through. And not be able to respond or kind of manage them through that. So there has to be a toughness, and there has to be a, caring, compassionate side.
And this is so off script now, it's unbelievable. But I do think something that mobility is often struggle with as well is testing for people's ability to interact with vendors. It's quite an interesting aspect of the role. Even relatively junior positions, relative to most sectors, even within HR, you are dealing with vendors a lot. RMCs, immigration, tax, compensation potentially. It's like quite an unusual aspect, fun part of the role. But how do you test for people's ability to sort of interact, but also, just work well with vendors?
It's a really specific thing to mobility, because you're asking them to do something within a specific definition. And you may be negotiating cost. Like there's all these component parts. And people entering mobility, like I entered the mobility industry in my 20s and had some experience. I was lucky to have some experience with that. But I can imagine going in there and being like, I have no idea, how do I,
100%.
and how aggressive can I be? And
Yeah.
so, um, it's, it, something, there's some on the job coaching that
Yeah.
happens in that side of it, but you really do have to be able, especially with estate agents and things like that. Like, you're talking about somebody's most important decision,
Yeah.
and you're pushing people on price and
Yeah.
time and things. So I think the questions and the kind of inquiry into a candidate that may enter the relo world that's where you have to push a little bit.
Yeah. For
And you
sure.
can't just be gentle and say, hey, if this happens, like, how do you feel? It has to be like, what's the solution?
Yeah. Such gold. Such gold. It's sort of, it is an area where it's like, when you're in an actual case, they're going to be pushing back. There's going to be some actual negotiation. There's not room to be squishy, so don't be squishy in the interview, because the real life isn't squishy at all there. So I love that. Don't be afraid.
Or there may be no solution. Like, there might not
also
be a
true.
solution. So, and some people are just, especially this day and age, we have solutions to everything in our fingertips. So being able to go in and say, listen, there is not a solution. There's alternatives.
Yeah, I love that as well, because we see this the whole time as well. Sometimes it's like, it might be impossible to get a visa, or it might be impossible to get a house for a certain price. There might literally be no house available. It's just, that is a feasible scenario. But like, what else can you do in that situation? What would you do in their shoes? Don't just say the facts. Like, hey, like, what's the next step? So love that advice. And it is such a unique part of this industry that is overlooked, I think, when hiring.
We can, I always tell people, like, we can airlift your car to your destination. We can have it there in like 8 hours. It will cost $600,000.
Exactly. Everything's feasible.
Like, sell the Prius and get a Maserati Bora, and then you'll be fine. So
exactly.
It's but there's always alternatives, but like, they really have to be weighed against all of the other factors.
100%. And I think that goes back to, like, part of the fun creativity of this job is you are often facing those scenarios of this or that, or like, this isn't going to work out, but do this, and that is that sort of creative problem solving is such a key aspect of which I think most roles in our industry, which is really, really fun. We're rapidly, I know you're on the schedule, so we're rapidly sort of moving on to our final question, which is a great tradition of the pod, which is where the previous guest leaves a question, and you've got one which I don't know if you, ballpark, have ever estimated how many sort of relocations you've been loosely involved in, but I know it will be tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands. Question for you today is, what's the most unique move / assignment / situation within an assignment that you've seen, and what happened?
Most unique situation. I mean, all of them.
All of them, that's true.
Yeah, it's thousands. But I think been asked to do really strange things from time to time, and in most cases they are around people's pets.
Oh yeah.
And we shipped a lot of horses around the world and things like that. One of the guys I've worked with in the industry, Dave Eaton, who's a wonderful guy and brilliant, told this story, and it was really interesting. A guy who was going to China, they had shipped koi. And the koi were prized koi. And when they got there, they had a kind of unveiling. They had this pond they had built and everything. It's my understanding that the local cormorants that were flying around literally ate the koi in a matter of, hours after they were placed in the pond. So we see stuff like that all the time, and it's hard, like, especially when it's the busy moving season. It accelerates the craziness. So, and no offense to moving companies, but sometimes they're struggling to get labor to do the
100%. Yeah.
And so people aren't used to that environment in the home. So you hear a lot of, like, the transferring employee's dog went out and ate everybody's lunch, then can we cover lunch? And so there's things like that. There's also
Yeah.
ones that become really serious really quick. In that immigration discussion, we had people that were coming over to support a company where the machinery was operated by a company where the specialists in that machinery were from Syria.
Wow.
And so as the administration changed and it locked down people coming in, we had to reach out to people getting on flights and say, don't get on the flight because we're concerned that you might not get in and you might not get out. And so stuff like that, stuff like the impact of COVID. I was getting on a plane to Europe on the 19th of March that year. And you know, had to not get on the plane myself. So yeah, it's
all sorts. There's
all sorts. It's exciting.
It is exciting. It is exciting, and it's like it sort of goes from the sort of brevity, proverbial but realistic. The dog ate your lunch to you know, sometimes more serious stuff. But the idea that's on the horse travel relocations, I would highly recommend to anyone listening. If you haven't seen how horses get relocated at their settlement, look that up right now. I remember the first time someone was like, we're relocating horses, and I was like, how do you do that? And they shared a photo. I was like, whoa, that is so crazy.
It's amazing.
It's amazing. So if there's one major takeaway, look up how horses are flown around the world, because that is an incredible image.
One quick note, the other craziest thing was working in a home sale program where when we received the title search, there was a divorce being filed. And so we called the filee, which was the transferee's spouse. And they said, no, I'm withdrawing that. I don't want to go through. But they hadn't told their spouse. And so we almost went through a review of the title and, divorce and everything. And it would have been the first that the employee had heard that their spouse wanted a divorce. So luckily we were really, really thorough about our review of what came up in legal documentation, and that there was no hole. There wouldn't have been health litigation. But it's fine that stuff doesn't happen. But it was like
close,
an inch away from disclosing a potential divorce that the employee didn't.
Wow, that is, you're sort of thinking, thank God that whoever was reviewing that was switched on that day, because that is like the worst case scenario where you're like, whoa, that's fun.
And it ended well. She still loved him.
Good.
That was the closest call I've ever had.
My heart is beating just thinking about that situation. To be honest, Larry, it's all dozens of years later. It's like, wow, that must have been close. So, Larry, this has been such great fun. And we could go on for hours, I'm sure, particularly speaking about any of those situations you just mentioned about, because it is the crazy and beautiful thing about our industry is just how unique every relocation is, and it throws up so many stories. So thank you so much for coming on, being generous with your time and thoughts. I have to catch up again after all the elections this year and check in on what is what's the impact been, because I love your insights there as well. But thanks so much for coming on, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Cheers.